I would love to tell you that this video holds the answers. Answers to questions like, why do I always feel lonely and isolated? Was it always like this? What can we do about it? What can I do about it? Can we even do anything about it? But that would be a lie, because if anything, what follows is an admission of how perverse loneliness has become as a problem. A problem so deep and vast, an equation so complex that no one really knows the answer to. So if this video isn't that, then what is it? It's an exploration, an investigation, and hopefully a call to action. Because, and I don't have a bloody clue why it is like this, people seem to just not care about loneliness. Sure, we talk about anxiety and depression and all the other funsies, but feeling lonely is often what starts it all. And yet, no one seems to want to do anything about it. We do surveys and collect statistics. We discuss the impact it has and everything like that. But what are the actual plans for fixing this? More than that, can we even fix this? Because, and I apologize for being a negative Nancy here, loneliness is starting to feel like a permanent state. An irreversible process, a thing we just have to get used to. But beyond this, nothing gets done because we treat the problem like it is something out there, rather than something inside of us. We see it as a social construct, not an individual problem, which is odd, since from my experience, this feeling of being lonely is intensely personal and individualized. Loneliness is an intimate, private problem, but how widespread and common it is, that is societal. So while we know that social isolation and loneliness are real issues, we are still told to just get over it, stop being so lonely, or my personal favorite, get friends. But you can have the rowdiest, loudest friend circle and still feel so alone. You can be surrounded by family and still feel lonely. I mean, the entire concept of loneliness is inherently subjective, which makes it all the more difficult to understand. We are constantly bombarded with images and ideals of what happiness is. It's almost as if we have collectively decided that the only way to be happy is through social connections. But loneliness isn't simply the absence of people, and there is quite a big difference between being alone and being lonely. In many ways, the very act of being around others can only make everything worse. No, loneliness is a feeling of emptiness and disconnect, a sense of isolation, alienation, and just not belonging. This is the crux of loneliness, an emotional state, a subjective experience. I think one of the more frustrating aspects of this topic is that it's horribly difficult to even define what loneliness is. According to the internet, loneliness is simply the feeling of being alone, or the fact that you are by yourself. But as always, there is much more to it than that. You can be in a crowded room or a house filled with bored nephews and overexcited aunts and still feel alone. Defining loneliness as the act of being alone is like defining depression as being sad or anxiety as having worries. There is much more to it, and some of it can so easily contradict itself. But for the sake of this video, I think it's most appropriate to define loneliness as a feeling, a deep, churning pit in your stomach, a cut that never bleeds profusely but is also everlasting, never healing. I need you to do something. Go look up loneliness graphs and have a peek. You will find a whole bunch of statistics and numbers and facts. You will see a chart showing the rise of loneliness in the past few decades. And I know that a graph is just a bunch of numbers, all lined up in pretty little boxes. But when you look at it, really look at it and let yourself digest all that information, a picture forms, a reality where we are living in the loneliness epidemic. And I know what you're thinking. Sure, loneliness is a problem, But it's not like a serial killer, it's not a mass murderer. No one's dying. But they are. We are. What causes loneliness is difficult to nail down. But what loneliness causes is a question that is quite a bit easier to answer. True loneliness is so painful that the patient often has to hide it, disguise it, defend himself from it. It's a little bug that digs in and refuses to leave. Lurking and festering, it grows until it's all-consuming. Loneliness, like other mental issues, like anxiety and paranoia, can go from something that's just a part of you to something you're entirely defined by. Psychologically, there are more than a few effects of prolonged loneliness: hypervigilance, threat perception, cognitive decline, and even the inability to experience joy or pleasure. This last one is particularly vicious and interesting because loneliness isn't a situation or a circumstance. It's a feeling. Sure, you can change your environment to combat it, but it's not a sure thing. Bone-deep isolation can cause the very fabric of who you are to erode. It can make everything seem grey and meaningless. This is such a dangerous state to be in. But there is more, so much more. Isolation, as a psychological issue, can change not only how we look at the world and the people around us, but also how we see ourselves. A little bit of alone time can make us question our social groups, our support structures, and the people we spend the most time with. But a lot of loneliness can make us question whether we are a good person or not. It's so easy to think, oh, it must be a me problem, or I must deserve to feel like this. It's a terrible cycle. It makes us think we are unworthy, which in turn drives us to withdraw further from the society and perpetuates the problem. When it comes to mental issues, it's actually a bit redundant to talk about them because, well, it's the usual suspects: depression, anxiety, insomnia, paranoia, the works. These cursed things that can flatten you by themselves only get boosted in the presence of true prolonged loneliness. And that's even without talking about the physical repercussions. It has been well established that social isolation and loneliness can lead to a higher risk of high blood pressure, heart disease, obesity, anxiety, depression, memory issues, and even death. So yeah, it can affect a lot. And it is not just in your head either. It's in your blood, your bones, and your body. The problem is that loneliness isn't a standalone issue. It's a symptom, a sign of a bigger problem. But it also can be an illness all by itself. Something that can eat you from the inside out if you let it take over your life and consume everything around you. Social media gets a bad rap, and honestly, a lot of it is deserved. It can make us feel isolated, make us compare ourselves to others, and create FOMO among a whole host of other problems. But if there is one thing I should be saying, it's this: social media makes us feel connected to others. But that's not quite right also, is it? The idea that Facebook and WhatsApp help us feel less alone is a misconception and a paradox. For in the process of connecting with others, we disconnect from them. It's the casual, almost who gives a fuck attitude we have that renders these connections never genuine, never real. And I don't think this was the case in the early days. I'll show my age here, but I remember when being Facebook friends with someone felt special, almost intimate. Sharing an experience was the highlight of your day, and a like button was a rare and precious thing. Something you saved for posts and comments you truly appreciated. But now Facebook itself is an old age home, chock full of senile grandpas and bored aunties. And the majority of social media is just people screeching at each other. In such a space, the only connecting we do is to ridicule, taunt, and troll. Think of it this way: there is a time for loud, over-exuberant, superficial get-togethers, where everyone lies through their teeth, casually saying things like, "Oh, my son just got into Harvard," Or, yeah, Vishy just got promoted at work. Or the classic, no, I have not lost any weight. But those cannot be all. They are meant to be the one-off, the exception. Today, Facebook embodies that. An eye-watering hellscape of pretense, envy, and thinly veiled contempt. There is barely anything authentic or genuine left. Social media is now a party where a lot is being said, shouted, and screamed, but nothing is being heard. And there are a few more elements that add to this feeling of being in an echo chamber. It primarily seems to be a quality thing. Everything today encourages us to do more, see more, experience more, but to not actually care more or be better people, do they? We can all post 1,000 photos a day, but we can't even send a hope you're feeling well soon text to someone who might be feeling under the weather or having a bad day, can we? And honestly, the more likes you get, the less you're seen, the more you're just another faceless profile. Pure concentrated validation is also another factor. See, in real world interactions, there are no likes, no follows, and no shares. There are only soft smiles, warm words, and gentle touches that say more than any of the others combined. It's a subtle and delicate dance where we aim to make everyone around us feel all the much better and somehow feel good ourselves. This vital thing gets turned into a currency, an algorithmic robotic system where the amount of likes you can garner is the only metric worth taking note of, because it's the only one that matters, the only one we have any control over, and in a twisted way, the only one we can use to gauge how much others care about us. So it's not really a real connection, is it? Listen, I don't mean to imply that we as a society want to be lonely, but our desire for other things often overshadows our need for connection. How many of us would willingly embrace loneliness and depression if it meant landing that six-figure job? Quite a few actually. Many of us already feel alone, with social circles that resemble dots and straight lines. So why bother trying to change it? Sure, you may feel a bit down, but you can always go through Instagram and scroll a little and feel a lot better, right? In our pursuit of financial stability, material comfort, and self-sufficiency, we neglect our relationships and in the process neglect ourselves. And everyone's guilty of this. It's not even that much of a crime, honestly, because it is so normalized in our society. It's almost sensible. There are very few things people won't sacrifice to keep their heads above water. The problem is that once you start feeling the effects of loneliness, it's often too late to fix it easily. You're too far down the rabbit hole, isolated and struggling to reconnect. And that's a terrifying place to be, because at that point, it's no longer a feeling, it's a condition, a state of being. And then, as if by some social gravity, your friend group slowly evolves to match your experience. People with everything, but no one to share it with. Slightly depressed, sometimes sad, and often tired, they become echoes of each other, stuck in a loop of superficial conversations and hollow laughter. The truth is that we despise loneliness, but we still endure it, then face the alternatives. The sacrifices needed to avoid it, giving up stable income, risking financial comfort, and embracing vulnerability, seem far too worse. And that's where the problem lies. Because there is no real incentive to change, no tangible reward that outweighs the cost. Loneliness is a problem of the heart and the mind, and ironically, these are often the last things society cares about. We talk about it in blog posts, make videos like this, even romanticize it, but no one cares enough to actually change anything. And that, in a nutshell, is the real tragedy of loneliness. It's a problem, yes, but for the most of us, it's the lesser evil. The lesser evil compared to financial insecurity, unemployment, or any of life's other material challenges. For most of us, saying, "I quit my job because I felt lonely," sounds bizarre, right? It's a weird thing to be upset about, a weird thing to prioritize, a weird thing to talk about, and yet here we are, quietly carrying the weight. I feel lonely often feels like an admission of personal failure. I don't have a social life often feels like a shameful confession, something that's hard to share or even address. So, a lot of times, when faced with these feelings, our natural reaction is to dismiss or suppress them, often through unhealthy means, whether it's workaholism, excessive consumption, or escapist fantasies. These are the things that can fill up the cracks in the dam, that can make it feel like, well, I might be lonely, but at least I'm busy and productive. At least I'm not wasting time or slacking off at a bar somewhere. Unlike most people, I'm actually doing something. And sure, sometimes this could work. Sometimes it's actually better to stay away and get ahead than wallow in self-pity and misery and all the other things that go with it. A focus on productivity can feel empowering. It gives us a sense of control, of purpose. But for many, it's also a way to keep that underlying ache of isolation and bone-deep weariness at bay. And when that's all you have, it can quickly become a crutch or even a destructive coping mechanism. These elements combined turn the subject of friendlessness and feeling oh so cut off from the world almost taboo, almost like a dirty little secret that we would rather keep buried deep down instead of ever addressing it, even while the feeling just keeps getting stronger and stronger and stronger. But here's the thing, why is it so hard to cope with loneliness? Notice how I said cope, not fix or cure. Because cope is realistically the best many of us can do. Some will always feel lonely despite every effort, and that's okay. It's just a part of life at that point. On those rainy nights, alone on a late subway, the world feels distant. All we can do is cope. Our culture sets unrealistic expectations, especially for young people. We are supposed to have great careers, families, and social lives. But it's so tough to excel at one thing, let alone at everything. Some of us may achieve career success but feel isolated. Others might start families early and lack stability. Ultimately, we all prioritize differently. Friendships matter, but so do other pursuits. Loneliness is a problem that's difficult to identify, difficult to talk about, and enormously difficult to solve. While we desire social connections and belonging, we also hold back from making those connections and taking that risk, because there's a perceived danger in doing so. Loneliness is also a contradiction, because you can be out with half a dozen other people and still feel lonely, or you can be completely alone and not feel lonely at all, even for a second, depending on the circumstances and a million other unquantifiable things that are almost always out of our control. In a world that prioritizes superficial interactions and glosses over the deeper emotional connections we crave, it is crucial to recognize loneliness not as a sign of weakness, but as a universal human experience. Let's not simply dismiss loneliness as a personal feeling or a fleeting phase or just another mental issue. Instead, let's confront it as a fundamental human struggle that deserves our attention and compassion.